Okay, so we're here with Stewart Emery, the co-author of Who's in Your Room, and actually the original idea for Who's in Your Room came from you, and Ivan finally convinced you, and you guys convinced each other to do the book. So that was good. So we're here with some questions for you today, Stewart.
Okay, great. It was interesting how Ivan got involved. He was at a TLC event in a hotel room in Los Angeles, Santa Monica, and he heard the talk, and he realized he had a business problem that was costing him like seven figures. And he said, "I got the wrong person in my room, in that technology room." He went back to his business, made the change, and it was just transformational. So he came on board as having this, you know, result that made $1 million difference to him. And
It's
so
not
he
a small
was converted
difference.
in that moment. And then he bugged me ever since to turn it into something. And now you've been bugging me ever since, and you're turning it into something in partnership with us. And we couldn't be more delighted.
Well, we're grateful for your time today.
Yeah.
So the first question that came in is asking about how do you deal with a family member who you've put in a permanent lockbox due to their toxicity in general, but other family expects you to interact with and be around them.
Do you mean other family members expect you to interact with this person who's
Yeah, so
in the
we put them
lockbox?
in the lockbox, but other family members think maybe they shouldn't be in the lockbox or want us to be interacting with that person.
Well, it's a tough one. We all have toxic family members we have to deal with, and we put them in lock boxes. And I think what's worked for me is to tell people just to get out of the middle of this, or they get meet a similar fate.
But out.
That's right. It's an expandable lockbox. Just saying.
Yeah.
Um, but have an authentic conversation about it and say, I understand that you want to interact with this person. It simply doesn't work for me. And I have done great with the doorman. So I normally say something like, I like you a bunch, but my doorman says you're not coming in.
Do you ever explain the values correlated to that in a
Correct. So I usually set this up by talking to people about who's in your room, obviously, and the concept of the doorman, and the and with the concept of who's in your room, try to have people understand the dramatic impact that has in your life, for better or for worse, as we say, until death do us part, because that's the only time everybody gets out of the room, right? You're out of the room too. So, having said that, then I let people know that um, I have this relationship with this character called the doorman, and they look at you weird sometimes. I say, okay, so when you were a kid, did you have like a bunny that was in the room or a dog that was in the room that you would talk to? And even guys will fess up to this. You got to probe a little bit, but like, wink at them and say, yeah, well, yeah, okay. And they kind of get it. And I said, so I have this doorman, and we have a conversation with the doorman. I like it on Beat Bobby Flay where the host is by themselves. They said, well, I have to have a conversation. So I put a towel up and have this conversation, and there's nobody there, but they're having the conversation. So it's kind of like that, and people get it.
Yeah.
And I say, so if I break this bond and this process that I have with the doorman, then that whole system breaks down. And the other thing that I talk about now, it's probably not relevant for really young people, perhaps. But here I am. I'm going to be like 83, and well, what's the date today? The 6th, 18th. In 13 days, I'll be 83, and so I have this concept, or I call, how are you going to spend the breaths you have left?
Mm.
Now I've had lifelong respiratory problems, so that has particular significance for me as an idea. And then Janine Roth, who's such a dear friend, wrote a wonderful essay called how will you treasure the breaths you've got left? And I think that's in Who's in Your Room. And we've have so many editions of Who's in Your Room now, I lose track of what's in which one, but I believe it's in. So, and I have that conversation with people, and actually even young people I find can relate to that. I think they've seen enough of what's going on in the world to understand that life's not infinite. Even if you're a young person, it's not infinite. And so they can get behind the breaths you have left. And then I'll say, I put this family member in the room that's pretty toxic to me. I just have not been able to get the relationship to work. And I understand that they'd probably like you to get me to talk to them, and that's not going to happen. I'm not going to spend the breaths I have left trying to work this out.
Man, I love that concept. And something that's helped me too with that conversation is taking the judgment out of the person out of the conversation and saying, either whether it's directly to them or to the family member, and saying, this is not a judgment of them as a bad person. And I understand you have a relationship with them and I respect that, and
Yeah.
that works. And because of the value that I have, and I explain the core value that's being valued from my perspective.
Yeah.
My doorman is saying, because of this value of loyalty or service or whatever the thing is, to say there's a disconnect on the values, and I've just chosen that if there's a disconnect on the values, that's not a relationship that I interact with. But again, it doesn't mean that they're a bad person, and I respect your relationship with them, because I feel like some people, if you say, oh, I don't like this, I'm not going to have a relationship with this person that you do, it's also judging that person for
Right.
having a relationship with them,
Yeah,
right?
I love the way you just talked about you got to get the judgment out of it.
Yeah.
And I think it's very hard for most people to get around the idea that if you have somebody in the lockbox, that automatically implies you think they're a bad person. That's not the case at all. We used to teach a course way back. It was a long offside, executive offside, and we looked at this idea that came, I think, originally from Zen, or it might have been, I think it was Zen, about levels of relationship with life. So I'm doing it very simply. The first level is the relationship you have with life is one of judgment. Things are intrinsically good or bad, good or evil. And the corollary is, and the Lord Almighty put me on earth to be the dispenser of that judgment. Right? We all we all have people who have that role, right? Or think they have that role. The
Absolutely.
next level up is what we call the level of distinction. Or probably before the level of distinction, the level of evaluation, where you see something for what it is, and you determine, does that have enough value in this situation for it to be included in what's going on? And if yes, in; if not, not in. So that's kind of like the doorman's call. Here are the values. Here's this person. This appears to be their values. Is there a value match? And if there isn't, then there's not a harmonious possibility of this person being included in this activity or this being present in this room. And there's no inherent good or bad in that determination. And I think that that's really important. And then at higher levels of distinction, then you're getting more into particular values and particular skills, a lot of other things. But this idea that above judgment, there's evaluation. And when you're in evaluation, that doesn't have any implications of good or bad in it. So the way you talked about that was great, I thought.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Next question. You ready? So, how do you handle being in a challenge or course or other environment with someone who you thought would be a good addition to your room, but then you find out during a one-to-one conversation that you shouldn't have offered to let them join your room? So you've already let them in the room. They're part of a group that you're in, and now you don't want to have personal interactions with that individual.
Yes, well, you're right. Once they're in the room, they're in the room.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether it came from, I think, somebody's mother who said, well, we could try benign neglect. I do that with some of my children when they're it's like putting them in the corner. I said, well, help me understand what's benign neglect. Well, you're not nasty to them. You're not calling them out. You simply neglect them. You don't interact. And, you notice that they're there, but when you're looking across the room, you don't really pause, you go like that. So you've just got to ratchet down. That's probably the wrong word, ratchet. We say ratchet up, but just wind down interaction with them. and they'll either get the message or they won't. Now, if they notice, sometimes what happens is you wind down interaction with somebody, and what they did that got you to want to do that, they'll now do more of. Right? They'll if they're acting out a little bit and you ignore them, then they'll think, well, the problem is I'm not acting out enough, so I'll ratchet up my acting out. Right? So you got to be ready for them becoming perhaps more extreme in their tactics to try and get you to keep them in the room or have interactions with them. And then eventually, if you can't sort it out, then down to the dungeon or the lockbox.
So let's talk a little bit more specifically around that, because I think that's a challenge that a lot of people have is, well, in my head, I put them in the lockbox, but they're banging on the lockbox door and it's getting loud and it's
Well,
disruptive.
yeah, but I think they have a term for that in social media. It's called ghosting, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Basically, you ghost them.
So ghosting, blocking. Well, what if they're at work or you can't ghost or block them? What's a conversation to transition from them assertively or aggressively trying to still be in your room to understanding they're in the lockbox and that's not going to change?
You've just got to uh, stay at it. And there are people you can be in relationships that interaction is not can't be chosen. It's a given. You can't choose to not interact at all. No interaction is not an option. So in those scenarios, you've just got to learn to cope. You've got to come up with coping strategies.
Mm-hmm.
And of all of the coping strategies, um, demand that you don't indulge their behavior, and you don't try to inflame people, but you keep the conversation as brief as you can possibly keep it, and the interactions become tactical, not not relational.
Mm.
The transactional conversations, not relational conversations. And usually people will move on after a while. I found that at some point, it's like a kid having a tantrum. If you give in to the tantrum, you are training them that what works is having tantrums. And I've watched people. I knew somebody well. It was one of my wife's, one of Joni's relatives, and they developed a way of dealing with the world by yelling at people. And years and years later, when they were getting ready to pass on, I said, why were you always that way? And they said, well, when I was a little girl, my parents wanted to move and I didn't want to move, and they yelled and screamed and had a tantrum, and they ended up not moving. So I guess I thought that's how you handle life. I said, has it made you happy for 90 years? No, not so much. Whoops. We should have had this conversation later, but I wasn't born back then.
Yeah.
So you've got to be careful if you're there to serve people, and I don't mean in a subservient way, but if your goal is to move things in the direction of goodness, then I think that you've got to be careful that how you're handling it isn't going to reinforce people's bad behavior,
Mm-hmm.
and anything you do to pay it off reinforces it.
I have a question about so there's different lock boxes, right? There's the permanent lockbox,
Yeah,
which is I've absolutely decided that person is not going to be in my
yeah,
life. There is the I'm I'm putting them in timeout
yeah,
lockbox, which is they may earn a chance to get back. And then there's I'm still deciding. And so when we're looking at the second and the third lock boxes of things are still up in the air, maybe I'll let them back in, maybe I won't. What would be a good conversation to have with that person, or when would it be appropriate to have a conversation
yeah,
with that person about here's the boundary. that you crossed. Here's what would allow you to be in my room. Here's what's going to keep you in the lockbox.
Yeah. So that's a terrific question. It kind of follows on the last one, not surprisingly, of course. But we say, okay, somebody's having a tantrum, a kid has a tantrum. At some point, if they don't get what they want out of tantrums, they just stop having tantrums, at least with you. And I find, for example, that people relate to me differently than they'll relate to most people, because what they find works with most people just isn't going to work with me. I'm the wrong guy to have verbal jujitsu with. I usually win that one. So people don't do it. People don't like losing, and if they realize they're going to act out with you, and that's not going to get them what they want, and they're losing. But if you're going to have the open conversation with them, you can't say things like, well, when you do this, you just make me feel I don't want to be with you. Then that's blaming them and making them the source of how you feel inside.
Mm-hmm.
So, but if you say something like, when you start yelling, I just notice that I don't want to be around you. I don't even want to try and deal with it. I don't even want to talk to you about your issue. I don't want to have a relationship with you. This is a response I have when you do this. So you're not saying when you do this, you make me. You're saying when you do this, how it impacts me is.
Mm-hmm.
I notice my response is this. I notice how I feel is this. It's not you make me feel this way or you make me respond this way. So if you can link for them their behavior and how you respond inside to it, even externally to it, then you're just laying down the relationship between their behavior and the results without including blame in the equation. Because once you include blame, you are implying judgment.
I love that. So what I heard is essentially you would say, I'm really focused on pursuing more peace in my life or whatever the outcome is or the value, because we've done values work. And when people yell, that disturbs my peace. And so I've chosen not to include yelling in my life. And so if you're insisting on having that behavior, then that's a time where I just won't have you in my world.
Yeah.
So it's again focusing on the behavior,
Correct.
being a reason for why, a personal reason. This is not about you, it's about me. I've chosen not to have this in my world. And you can do that all you want. But the boundary is that if you do, you are automatically self-excluding yourself from my world.
Correct. Yeah. So the fact that they're not in your room is their choice through their behavior.
Yeah.
Because you're teaching people that, behavior has consequences.
Right. Shocker.
Yeah. How about that? Yeah. So if you're doing this with me, these are the consequences with me. I mean, you may have other friends who just love drama, right? So you're totally wired for that. You need to be in a relationship with people who are wired for drama. I'm just not one of those people.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's the boundaries. It's having people clearly understand what your boundaries are, and the boundaries are defined by your values.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the values piece is difficult for people. I find people get knotted up, or they stumble over thinking that there's a set of values that are socially acceptable and ordained by God. And it's really hard to, as it were, take responsibility for owning your own values, of saying, this is what matters to me, and I'm going to honor that. It's hard sometimes for people to say, I'm owning my own goodness. A lot of people's behavior, which appears to be excellent, is constrained by their fear of what would happen if they weren't that way. If I wasn't a good little girl or a good little boy, this would happen. Therefore, I'll method act my way through life being a good little boy or a good little girl. And then, the bitterness builds up, and then one day there's an explosion. So for people to choose their behavior because they choose their behavior, not because they're going to please somebody, not for all of these reasons. You've seen the old chocolate and vanilla demonstration,
Yes.
I'm sure.
Yes. Which one?
Yeah, you're going to do chocolate, you're going to choose vanilla. That's I've watched that change people's lives just when they get it. We're not going to do it now, but if you get popular across, we might do it.
Very good.
Yeah.
I have another question that's a little bit lighter. So with the people that are in your room, if they're not necessarily in the lockbox, however, we want to bring them closer in proximity. We want to have more affinity and resonance with that person, and they don't understand the work of who's in your room or the other things that we're talking about.
Yeah.
What's a good way for someone who has been through the challenge and has a basic understanding of the concepts of who's in your room and is working on their own values and their own boundaries to just have a conversation with someone, not someone in the lockbox, but just someone who they want a closer, deeper, values-based relationship with, to introduce that concept?
Well, you can give them the book for a start. That's a good place to start. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I hand out the copies of the book to people, and I've watched it absolutely change their lives. And then we use that word too as a throwaway line, unfortunately, in this work. Um, but I have a dear friend, very talented person, and a chef and a food expert on seafood and sustainable aquaculture. And she's in a relationship, and those people who see her in love thought that was a difficult relationship for her. And we gave her the book and didn't say anything to say, hey, read this book. And she's now sorting that out. Either uh, the person that she's in a relationship will end up in a lockbox or end up on another planet, but she's dealing with it, right? She just realizes that having the relationship as it exists in this moment doesn't serve her or the other person. And I think that's the hard part, maybe not to get your head around is if it's not working for you, while the person's behavior in their mind in the moment makes total sense to them, if you could get them or work with them to getting beyond that, their life would be better off too. So I think that people, when we're laying down those boundaries, we kind of are frightened we're hurting people or we're doing bad things to them. But the truth of the matter is, for people's lives to get better, the people around them would serve them by not letting them get away with destructive behavior that doesn't serve them and doesn't serve the community.
Yeah. I think
So you
that,
want to be, so we're in essence saying if you're going to have a relationship with somebody, they've got to be doing the work. I mean, if you look at, yeah, they've got to be doing the work. So that becomes a core value. If you're not doing the work, I'll be polite. I won't be yell at you. I won't be unkind to you, but I'll be polite. Our relationship will be transactional. It won't be our relationship.
yeah,
It won't be a friendship. Friendships are like gardens. You've got to grow them and water them and pay attention to them. And just as if you plant a garden, the soil has to be compatible with the needs of the plant. Then in your garden, you only want plants in it. You only want people in it. You only want relationships in it that are compatible with your values and your nature.
it's interesting you brought that up. That's actually one of the biggest takeaways that I had last year. I was doing a lot of work on myself, with myself, and that was probably the biggest epiphany is I will only be in close relationship with other people who know what the work is, know there's work to be done,
Yeah,
and are doing the work or pursuing doing the work in their own lives, because otherwise there is that incompatibility
correct.
that takes place. So they can stay on the porch,
Yes,
you can't come in the room.
correct.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
So you can have transactions with people on the porch. You only have a relationship with people in the room, which is another way to look at it.
absolutely. And I liked the distinction that you made too with boundaries about, this is not a negative thing. I'm setting a boundary with you in order to have better relationship with you. So it's a positive spin. It's I want the best for us, Thus, I'm setting a boundary so that we can be better, not so that I can make you feel bad or so that I can ostracize you or anything else, but for the benefit of us. And Susan Scott in Fierce Conversations, she talks about this too. And one of the foundational confrontational conversations, one of the foundational questions for that is to ask yourself is, do I actually want a relationship with this person? And only if I want to have a relationship with this person will I have this conversation with them. Otherwise, the
Correct.
conversation, you're in the lockbox. See you later.
There was a character called Lazarus who was a channeled entity, channeled by a fellow called Jack, who I like a bunch, and he's still around, but he's retired. But one of his famous quotes, somebody asked him a question, kind of like the first question you asked as a toxic family member. And Jack responds through Lazarus saying, yeah, he said, that's a problem, you know. This is a rule Lazarus says we should use. It's like Lazarus is now your doorman. If you met your family at a social function, would you ask them home for tea? And if you wouldn't, don't.
Hmm.
In other words, if you just applied the filter, if I met this person, this family member, and they weren't family members, and I met them at a social function, would I offer them an invitation to drop by for drinks? And if you wouldn't, don't. And if you're a family member, especially don't.
Mm-hmm.
So it's this idea of benign neglect. You know, because you can manage distance that way. Maybe somebody used to, they send you a text, you respond immediately. Then you go from immediately to an hour, then from immediately to an hour to a day to, oh, gee, I must have forgotten to respond to the text, right? So you just expand this out. And then people like that usually will then go for where they're getting instant gratification to their needs for attention.
Yeah.
And they just fade out. They, in effect, opt out because they're not getting what they think they need from the relationship.
Excellent. Well, that's all the questions that I had for today. I'd love to
Okay.
do this again. This was amazing.
Great. I wanted to leave this thought because the most important part of who's in your room for me, we haven't talked about yet, so maybe people will have questions for it, which is I want people in my room who are up to something. I had dinner last night with a person who was a direct report of Steve Jobs. And it was the guy who marketed the original iPod, you know, that little MP3 player that changed Apple's world. And his wife, he met at Apple, ran their education initiatives for a long time. And he's now a chairman of the Smithsonian, Harvard Smithsonian Institute for Astrophysics. So over dinner, they invited me to join the advisory board, Astrophysics Advisory Board, which I will do. I mean, it's exciting. And he said, yeah, come and we'll find alien life together, and which sounds like a flippant line, but we actually probably have the data already to say there's alien forms out there, and what are those forms? It seems improbable there isn't. We just have to process it, which is a lot of what the push for AI has to do.
Mm.
But they're also doing something else which is incredibly exciting. They have gotten the Taliban to agree to let girls at home through iPhones study STEM programs, that's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics.
Wow.
I said, dude, that's like a Trojan horse. He said, yep. So these people are up to something. So, you know, the conversation over dinner was, okay, there's an attraction here. We're going to be in each other's rooms. What's that going to look like?
Mm.
What are the values? What do we care about? So it's almost like it's a courtship in a way. And but they're up to something, and I still want to be up to something even at my age, or perhaps especially at my age. Because if you're not up to something, and so what does it mean to be up to something? Well, it means to be engaged in something that you feel will make this planet a better place for all of us. And that's, in engineering terms, is called moving things in the direction of goodness. So I like that idea.
Mhm.
Up to something means I'm engaged in the work at the very least.
Yeah.
I'm not just sitting around. Up to something means I'm focused on creating value, not just for myself, but creating value for the people I come in contact with, and the people I don't directly come in contact with, but are impacted in some way by how I show up every day. It's like dropping a stone in a pond. The ripples go a long way and touch people who don't even know where that ripple started, but nonetheless they're touched. So that becomes a core value. So then I've found that people who make a commitment to getting good at something just have better lives.
Mhm.
And the people around them who they impact have better lives. So you watch what it means to be an elite player, and you know about this, Isaac. In your field in the military, you were elite. And you know that you prefer being in a company who are up to being elite performers in some field. And I found it's amazing. It doesn't matter what the field is. It's a different conversation at that level of elite performance or a commitment to achieve elite performance. That does all is the conversation, it all is behavior, it all is the human interaction. And it's just amazing. You watch the bond that occurs between people in SEAL teams or people in athletic teams. They're like the bond between people in long-term friendships and in marriages. And so I think for me, one of the most impactful objects of Who's in Your Room, or aspects of, excuse me, Who's in Your Room, is the people in your room determine whether you're ever going to become a highly skilled person in a given field of activity. If you're in a room with people who are elite performers in that field, in that room with them, you'll get better. Joni was talking to Jimmy Connors one night. They go back a long way to a tennis club in Beverly Hills. And she was talking about the match he just played. And she said, "What do you like about playing that guy?" And he said, when I'm playing him, I play the best tennis of my life. I have to go to another level. And that's what I love about it. And there, the relationships are really exciting. You choose the people in your room are the people who will uplift you, who will support what matters to you, who will up level your skills in an area that is really something you're passionate about. That to me is the real power of Who's in Your Room, is to build that room, to develop the skills and the performance levels that make the better place for all of us. I think if you look in the mirror every day and say, am I doing the work that I need to be doing to live a life that is a gift to the world? I think that's a great question.
That's an amazing question. That's an
There's a
amazing.
very famous chef called Alice Waters, and she'd done a keynote here in Marin County. And afterwards, she was sitting at the bar by herself, just having a drink. Nobody was going up to her. This sometimes happens. She wasn't being mobbed. All the people there were very polite. But I had interviewed her for a book called Success Built to Last. And so we hadn't spoken for a while. And I interviewed her in a restaurant. And I went over and she said, "Hi, Stuart, it's been a while." I said, "Yes." I said, "I loved what you talked about tonight. Thank you." And I looked at her and I said, "Alice, I especially want to thank you for living a life that's a gift to the world."
Hmm.
And a tear just trickled down her cheek and hug. And when I look at people who really have earned that acknowledgement, who are really clear, are doing that. And I tell you, if that's how you want to live your life, the people you want in your room are the people who have made a commitment to living a life that's a gift to the world. So Who's in Your Room for me is all about that level of living.
I'm inspired, and I think we need to have more conversations about Be a Good One. We've talked about it in the
We
course.
have. Well, that's your next project, right?
Yeah, that's the next project, and I think it dovetails perfectly because we've talked a lot about masters and mentors and
Yes.
how they tie in with your life and how just being around that type of person influences who you become.
Yeah.
And this was a whole another level of insight into that, and I think awareness that is going to help people understand the importance to a different degree. So I really appreciate that.
All right. Well, it's lovely to connect. Thank
Likewise.
you. And thanks for the work you're doing with us. I really appreciate it. I love you.
I love you too. Thank you for making this
Thank you.
possible. This was fantastic. And
Thank
let's
you
talk
for
again
coming.
soon.
Ciao. Bye.